The morning Margaret Ashford revised her will, the Duke of Ravenscroft stood in his study holding the proof of his late wife's infidelity and told himself he'd been right never to trust her successor. But that was 3 months hence. On the October afternoon when Margaret first arrived at Ravenscroft Hall, she knew only that her cousin had died and left her nothing but a position she hadn't asked for, companion to a bitter widower who'd made clear he wanted no woman in his house. The carriage that delivered her was hired. She owned nothing that could be sold. The dress she wore was soft brown merino, her third mourning for her parents, worn now for simple economy. At 34, Margaret possessed the kind of face that disappeared in company. Dark brown hair severely dressed, gray eyes that revealed nothing, a figure gone thin from nursing her mother through 2 years of slow decline. She had been a gentlewoman's companion before, and a governess, and briefly a school matron. She knew precisely how much privacy a woman without fortune could expect, which was none. The Duke's steward met her in the entrance hall, not the drawing room. That told her everything. "Miss Ashford, His Grace wishes me to clarify your situation. You are engaged as a state companion. Lady Ravenscroft, the Duke's mother, requires assistance with correspondence and household management. You'll have a room in the East Wing, meals with the upper servants. His Grace does not entertain, does not receive, and does not expect to see you except at quarterly accounts." "Understood," Margaret said quietly. The steward's mouth thinned. "His Grace's late wife passed 2 years ago. He prefers the matter unmentioned." Of course. He led her through corridors lined with shrouded furniture, past rooms clearly unused, to a small chamber overlooking the kitchen gardens. Plain, clean, cold. Margaret set down her single trunk and did not let herself calculate how many positions she'd entered exactly this way. The Dowager Duchess she'd met that evening, a woman of 70 with sharp blue eyes and an acid tongue, confined to a wheelchair after a fall the previous winter. She examined Margaret with the thoroughness of a horse trader. "You're older than I expected." "I'm 34, Your Grace." "Good." The young one simpered. "Can you write a decent hand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Manage accounts without theft?" "I've never stolen, Your Grace." "Play chess?" Margaret hesitated. "Adequately." The Dowager smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. "You'll do. My son is a fool, but you're not to tell him I said so. Begin tomorrow, 8 o'clock. We'll start with the tenant correspondence he's been ignoring." For 3 weeks, Margaret worked. She wrote letters in the Dowager's elegant hand, reconciled household accounts that hadn't been properly managed since the late Duchess's death, quietly identified which servants were padding expenses and which were simply incompetent. She took meals alone, walked the gardens before dawn, spoke only when spoken to. The Duke she saw exactly twice. Once passing in the corridor, where he looked through her as if she were furniture, and once through the study window, standing motionless in the rain as if he'd forgotten he could go inside. The Dowager noticed her noticing. "My daughter-in-law was beautiful," she said without preamble, during their 4th chess game. "Golden-haired, accomplished, 17 when they married." Thomas was beside it. "Gave her everything. Jewels, horses, carte blanche in London. She redecorated this entire house in French silk." Margaret moved her and continued. "Says we're all deceivers, mercenary and false. I tell him he's being melodramatic, but grief makes men stupid. Because your references said you were plain, practical, and didn't gossip. Because you've nursed a dying parent and know what dignity in suffering looks like. Because someone needs to run this estate before my full son drives it into bankruptcy through sheer neglect, and I'm too old to do it from a wheeled chair." She leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to fix him, girl. I'm asking you to save Ravenscroft while he finishes breaking his own heart." It was not a kindness. It was a commission. Margaret discovered the full scope of the problem within a month. Unpaid bills, unrepaired tenant cottages, fields going fallow because the Duke refused to make decisions. He signed what his steward put before him without reading, spent days riding alone on the moors, and took dinner in his study so he wouldn't have to see another human face. The estate was dying as slowly as his wife had. Margaret began making lists. She worked carefully, quietly, identifying which repairs were urgent, which tenants needed rent forgiveness, which investments could be liquidated safely. She presented options to the Dowager, who approved them with grim satisfaction. The Duke never noticed. He was too busy grieving the woman who'd betrayed him. Until the morning Margaret found him in the portrait gallery, staring at his late wife's painting with an expression like murder. "She's still beautiful," he said without turning. His voice was rough and used, even knowing what she was. How is that possible? Margaret should have curtsied and left. Instead, she heard herself say, "Beauty and character are unrelated, Your Grace. One is accident, the other is choice." He turned then, really looked at her for the first time. His eyes were dark blue, red-rimmed, furious. "What would you know about it? I know that trustworthiness isn't visible, Your Grace. Neither is deceit. If it were, we'd all choose more wisely. You presume to counsel me? I presume nothing. You spoke. I answered." She met his gaze steadily. "Shall I go?" Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she didn't flinch. "Who are you?" "Margaret Ashford. Your mother's companion. I've been here 6 weeks. I don't want a companion in this house." "Then you should speak to your steward, Your Grace. I'm hired through Lady Day." She curtsied, precise, minimal, and left him standing before his beautiful, faithless wife. That night, the Dowager had a spell. The physician said her heart was failing. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft died on a January morning, quietly, with Margaret holding her hand. Her last words were, "Make him read the will properly. The codicil especially. Don't let that ass of a solicitor summarize." Margaret promised, though she didn't understand. The Duke took his mother's death like another stone in a cairn already too heavy to bear. He stood at the funeral in black superfine, silent and remote, while snow fell on the family vault. Margaret stood with the upper servants, equally silent. She'd wept privately the night before. The Dowager had been acerbic and demanding, and the closest thing to a friend Margaret had possessed in 5 years. After the funeral, the Duke's solicitor arrived from London. Mr. Pemberton was 60, pompous, and accustomed to summarizing documents for clients who couldn't be bothered with details. "The Dowager's will is quite straightforward, Your Grace," he began, settling in the study with port. "The usual bequests to servants, a few charitable donations. Her personal jewelry to be divided between the female staff according to a sealed list. The dower property in Kent returns to the estate, naturally. Nothing requiring your immediate." "I'll read it myself," the Duke said. Pemberton blinked. "Your Grace, I assure you, there's no need, the document." Now, the solicitor produced it with visible reluctance. The Duke read in silence, his expression unreadable, while Margaret stood by the window where she'd been cataloging the library. She should leave. But the Dowager's last words echoed, "Don't let that ass of a solicitor summarize." The Duke reached the codicil, went very still. "This must be an error. I assure you, Your Grace." The Dowager was quite clear. "She left the dower estate to my companion?" His voice could have shattered glass. £10,000 and a Kentish property to a woman I've spoken to precisely twice. Margaret's breath stopped. Pemberton cleared his throat. The Dowager added that codicil 3 weeks before her death. She was of sound mind, witnessed by myself and Dr. Bradford. The bequest is legal and irrevocable. The Duke turned to Margaret. His eyes were winter itself. "What did you do? Flatter her? Promise her heaven? Convince a dying woman to sign over property that's been in my family for—" "I did nothing, Your Grace." Margaret's voice stayed level through sheer force of will. "I knew nothing of this bequest until this moment. You expect me to believe that?" "I expect nothing. But it's true. Convenient. A fortune falls in your lap, and you claim perfect innocence. It's not a fortune, Your Grace. It's security. There's a difference." His laugh was ugly. "Of course. You're just a practical woman making her way in the world. How much did you manipulate her? How many chess games and sympathetic looks did it take?" Margaret felt something crack in her chest. Not anger, which would be too hot. Something colder and infinitely sharper. "Your mother," she said quietly, "was the only person in 5 years to treat me as if I possessed a mind. She was demanding and difficult and absolutely without sentiment. If she left me property, it's because she believed I earned it through competence, not manipulation. But you've already decided I'm a deceiver, Your Grace. Women always are, aren't we? Beautiful ones betray you with lovers. Plain ones steal with wills." The Duke's face went white. "You know nothing about. I know you've spent 2 years rotting in grief while your estate collapses. I know your tenants are 3 months from eviction because you won't approve repairs. I know you've dismissed 6 stewards in 18 months because they couldn't make you care about anything except your own betrayal. She paused. Your mother tried to save Ravenscroft because you wouldn't. She left me property because she knew I'd use it properly. I'm sorry that offends you. Get out. Gladly. Margaret curtsied and walked to the door. Miss Ashford. She stopped, didn't turn. I want you gone by morning. The will grants me residence in the Dower House immediately, Your Grace. I'll be gone within the hour. She left him standing in his study, surrounded by account books he wouldn't read and decisions he wouldn't make, and felt nothing but bone-deep weariness. / The Dower property was 12 miles distant. A small manor house, outdated but solid, with 40 acres of farmland and a surprisingly competent steward who'd been managing the dowager's private income for years. Margaret arrived after dark, was shown to a bedroom 3 times the size of her servants' quarters, and finally, allowed herself to weep. Not for the Duke's accusation, for the dowager's impossible, dangerous kindness, for the future she'd been given and would now have to navigate alone. In the morning, the steward presented her with account books. Her Grace instructed me to show you everything, miss. The property's been profitable, modest income, but steady. And there's this. He handed her a sealed letter in the dowager's hand. Margaret opened it with shaking fingers. Margaret, by now my fool son has accused you of manipulation and ordered you gone. Let him. You have property and income now. You owe Ravenscroft nothing. But if you're reading this, you're also reviewing the accounts, because you can't help yourself. So I'll tell you what I couldn't say living. The estate is 6 months from insolvency. Thomas won't see it until the bailiffs arrive. When that happens, he'll lose everything. Not because he's incompetent, but because he stopped caring whether anything survives. You could save it. You have the skill. But I'm not asking you to sacrifice your security for a man who called you a deceiver. I'm asking you to choose. For yourself. What you want your life to be. Choose well. Margaret sat in the small study of the house she now owned, holding a letter from a dead woman who had given her freedom and a choice in the same breath. Ravenscroft was dying. The Duke would lose everything, and Margaret could walk away. For 3 weeks, Margaret lived quietly in the Dower House, learning her property, meeting her tenants, discovering what it meant to wake in a house she owned. She did not write to the Duke. He did not write to her. But she thought about Ravenscroft constantly, about fields going fallow, about tenant cottages with leaking roofs, about account books the Duke signed without reading. The dowager had been right. He'd stopped caring just enough to lose everything. On the 4th week, Margaret's steward mentioned that Ravenscroft's creditors were calling in loans. Word is the Duke refused to sell timber rights that would have covered it, he said carefully. Pride, maybe. Or grief. Either way, he's 3 months from foreclosure. Margaret looked at her own account books. At the modest but steady income that meant she'd never be destitute again. At the future she'd been given. Then she made a list. / The Duke of Ravenscroft received Margaret's letter on a morning when the bailiff's notice sat on his desk like a death warrant. Your Grace, I'm settling £10,000 on Ravenscroft to clear your immediate debts. The funds will be managed through my solicitor with repayment terms that won't cripple the estate. I'm also transferring management of your timber rights and 3 tenant farms to a competent overseer I've engaged. This is not charity. It's investment in property I believe can be profitable again with proper management. You need not see me or thank me, but you do need to sign the enclosed documents. M. Ashford. The Duke read it twice. Looked at the settlement papers. At the precise accounting of Ravenscroft's debts and the schedule for addressing each one. She was saving him. After he'd called her a manipulator and ordered her gone. She was saving his estate with money his mother had left her, money she could have used for her own security. He rode to the Dower House that afternoon. Margaret received him in a small parlor, wearing dove-gray wool and an expression of careful neutrality. She did not curtsy. Your Grace. Why? The word came out rougher than intended. Why what? Why save an estate that belongs to a man who accused you of deceit? Why not let me fail? Margaret folded her hands. Because Ravenscroft employs 40 families. Because your tenants deserve roofs that don't leak. Because good land shouldn't go fallow due to one man's grief. She paused. And because your mother asked me to choose what I wanted my life to be. This is what you want. To rescue ungrateful men. I want to be useful, Your Grace. I want work that matters. I want to sleep knowing I used my resources well. She met his eyes. Your mother gave me that chance. I'm taking it. The Duke stood in her parlor, his mother's parlor, now hers, and felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't begging for his approval, wasn't asking forgiveness for the bequest. She'd simply acted, competently and without drama, exactly as his mother would have. I was wrong, he said quietly. About you. About the will. I let old betrayal make me cruel. Yes, you did. I'm sorry. Margaret studied him. Your apology is noted, Your Grace. The settlement terms remain unchanged. I'll repay you. Every pound. With interest. I know. I structured the terms accordingly. A silence stretched. Outside, rain began to fall. My mother trusted you, he said finally. That should have been enough. Instead, I chose to believe every woman was my late wife, wearing a different face. Your wife betrayed you terribly. That doesn't make every woman a deceiver. It makes you wounded. Margaret's voice softened slightly. But wounds aren't excuses, Your Grace. At some point, you have to choose whether to heal or to rot. And if I don't know how, then you learn. The same way you'd learn anything difficult. He looked at her, really looked, the way he should have months ago. At her gray eyes that revealed everything if you bothered to see. At her plain dress and careful posture, and the quiet dignity that came from surviving loss after loss without bitterness. What? You teach me, he asked. Teach you what? How to trust again. How to see clearly. How to… He stopped. How to be half as brave as you are. Margaret shook her head slowly. I'm not brave, Your Grace. I'm practical. There's a difference. No. You chose to save an estate that belonged to a man who'd hurt you. You chose generosity when you could have chosen revenge. That's not practicality. That's courage. It's investment. It's both. He paused. Will you come back to Ravenscroft? Not as companion. As estate manager. Full authority, appropriate salary, respect you should have had from the beginning. I have a home now, Your Grace. Why would I give that up? Because you're bored here. He said it gently. Because managing a 40-acre property isn't enough for someone who could run a duchy. Because I need you, and I'm asking properly this time. Margaret stood very still. And if you decide in 6 months that you can't bear a woman in authority, that my decisions offend you, then you'll keep the salary and return here. But I won't decide that. I've spent 2 years proving that my judgment is catastrophically flawed. I'm choosing differently now. Choosing what? To trust competence over beauty. Action over words. A woman who shows me dignity over one who promises devotion. He extended his hand. Choose with me. Help me save Ravenscroft properly. Margaret looked at his hand. At the man who had called her a deceiver and was now asking her to share authority over everything he possessed. It was a terrible risk. It was also possibility. Trial period, she said finally. 6 months. If either of us finds the arrangement untenable, I return here without penalty. Agreed. She took his hand. His grip was warm, steady, nothing like a man who couldn't be trusted. Margaret returned to Ravenscroft as estate manager and transformed it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Within a year, the debts were managed, the tenants thriving, the fields productive again. The Duke learned to trust her decisions. Then her counsel, then her presence at breakfast, her voice in the library, the way she listened without judgment when grief still rose unexpectedly. He courted her slowly, with respect first, then friendship, then something deeper. Margaret resisted out of habit, then caution, then finally surrendered to the truth. She loved him. Not the title, not the property, the man who'd learned to choose healing over rot. 2 years after his mother's death, the Duke proposed in the estate office, surrounded by account books they'd balanced together. Margaret accepted in soft brown silk, holding his hand with the same careful competence she brought to everything. The settlement she'd made became her wedding gift back to Ravenscroft. The dower house remained hers in perpetuity, her security, her choice. No one who knew her story called her plain again. They called her formidable instead. And the Duke, who'd sworn never to trust a woman, spent the rest of his life proving that sometimes the greatest wisdom is admitting you were wrong.